Our next presenter is David Yeager. Mr. Yeager works as a staff engineer on the plan review team of the Plan and Technical Review section. David received his Bachelor's of Science in Agricultural Engineering from Texas A&M University. David is a licensed professional engineer with 38 years of experience in state agency service in water and wastewater related programs. David worked for the Texas Water Development Board for 30 years in the financing related construction programs and has been at the TCEQ for the past 8 years. Please welcome Mr. David Yeager.
Thank you. So we're at the end of the day. It's the bottom of the ninth. Bringing in the closer. All right, here we go. All right. Plan review and what is a significant change. So when you're making improvements at your public water system, most of the time you need to have an engineer draft those plans, and he creates plans and specifications, and those need to be submitted to the TCEQ for review. We all understand that. But there's some rule language that talks about, well, really it's significant changes need to be submitted for review. And so that's what we're going to be talking about. And I'm going to try to keep it clear in my head, and hopefully that'll help you keep it clear in your head, because we're going to talk about what's a significant change. And then towards the end, we're going to talk about what are some things that are not significant, and you don't have to submit those for plan review, and that's what you're really interested in, so you have to stay awake for the end of the presentation for the good stuff, okay? Are we ready to go? All right. What we're going to talk about is, of course, maybe a little bit here why we review plans, and then we'll talk about what's a significant change and that they require review, and then what would be considered not significant. All right. Of course, we review plans. It's part of the law. It's part of the Federal Safe Drinking Water Act. It's also a part of the Texas Water Code that plans will be submitted for review. Of course, we do this to protect public health. And, I think of it this way. It's like if we build a public water system according to these rules, and we maintain it, we make improvements that are according to the rules, and we've got a licensed operator, our hope is that we'll be delivering safe, healthy water to the citizens of the state of Texas. And if you're still looking for a good reason, well, your compliance investigator, when he comes along every 3 or 5 years, he may want to see that approval letter. So keep it, put it in your file, get it. So what's in a plan review? And of course, Vic covered this some, but of course it has to be submitted by a registered professional engineer. He's going to put a cover letter on it that says, this is what I'm trying to get approved. There is a form that we ask to be sent with the submittal that kind of gives us the details. Sometimes people might fail to tell us. They say, we just want approval of our water plant. Well, okay, what public water system is it? Where is it? Sometimes you need that form to give you the details. We need a sealed engineering report describing the system and the improvements. Sometimes that's going to be a pretty involved document. Sometimes that can be pretty brief, depending on what's going on. And then sealed plans, the plan sheets, and sealed specifications. And I guess one thing I was going to say when I got to this slide was, there's something has changed in the last 3 years. I don't know, well, especially before the pandemic, everything we were getting, every plan submittal was on paper. We were spreading out in our office. We had offices covered with plans and specs and engineering reports. And now it is, I don't know if it's 99.9% or what it is, but it's almost all electronic submittals that we have changed. We are paperless. Our letters get reviewed. We send them around electronically. Nothing is ever put in a folder. I may look like an old guy, and maybe I am, but I remember when we thought about a paperless office. That was That was a dream way back there. But now, I think we're there. We don't do nothing on paper. And, well, so, anyway. If you have to send us something on paper, we will take it, but we really want you to send it electronically. The rules say significant changes require a plan review. So, prior to making any significant change, you need to submit plans for approval, and public water systems shall submit plan specifications to the executive for the following significant changes. So then it defines significant changes in the rules. And so I'm going to go through the different things that are in the rules that are described as significant changes. So if you're increasing or decreasing production capacity, your wells, your surface water treatment plant, storage or pressure maintenance capacity, or your pumping capacity, those things that needs to be submitted. And of course, to break that down, so again, add or reduce sources, add or reduce storage, pressure tanks. And that, when it comes to sources, you're adding a new well, you're changing, let's say you're changing out a well pump for a larger or smaller pump, well, then that needs to be approved. Adding a source could be interconnecting with another water system. That needs to be approved. When you're looking at surface water, we're adding a new surface water intake. Well, then that needs to be approved. The old one got old. We're building a new one. We need to look at that. Changing the pumping capacity within the plant, that needs to be reviewed. And then the capacity of the units, that also. So then the rules cite, if you're changing the disinfection system, that is a significant. We have one rule that points out this about disinfection, and it's speaking to surface water and groundwater under the influence. And of course, these are the systems that have contact time studies for how long you're getting chlorine contact and disinfectant contact. And so that's treated, it's specialized in the rule that it's covering and saying, of course, so then if a surface water or GUI system is going from gas to sodium hypochlorite or free chlorine to chloramines, then you need to submit. But also in those cases, we're interested in changes in application points of where you're injecting the disinfectants, and also changes in the monitoring points, because that's all tied into the CT, and so those plans would need to be submitted. Then it also has another item, C, was proposed changes to the type of disinfection used to maintain a disinfectant residual in a distribution system. So this is out in distribution, and of course this kind of covers everybody. So if you're making changes in your disinfection from chlorine to chloramines, or chloramines to free chlorine, or increasing or decreasing capacity, you need to submit those. And we'd also, just since we're talking about it, when you're talking about disinfection, if you've got one source, a well over here that's on chlorine, and you're bringing in surface water from another direction, and it's chloramines, and that water is coming together in your system, it's just mixing in the system, that's no bueno. That is something we need to review, and you will probably need an exception to be able to do that. You probably need to separate some pressure planes and be able to keep those waters separate. Then it describes what would be a significant change in distribution. And so this is item D of the rule, and it says that greater than 10% of the number of connections. And so what that's talking about, let's say a community has 1,000 connections, and they're going to add 95 connections to the system with this distribution system project. The rule is saying that doesn't have to be submitted for plan review. So keep that in mind here. But wait a minute, what if that distribution affects your storage, that you don't no longer have enough storage capacity or no longer have enough source water, well, then you better submit it for review. And distribution, anytime you're doing interconnects, open or emergency, those need to be reviewed. But this 10%, keep that, we'll talk about that some more, but it just has to do with, if it's more than 10%, you need to submit it. If it's less than 10% of the number of connections, not the piping, but the number of connections. And here's the catch-all. You knew there was a trick. There's a statement, number E says, any other material changes specified by the executive director. So we have the ability to say, well, we think this is significant, and we're going to go through and talk about those things, all right, a little bit. Significant changes, other types, rehabilitation of major units, often wells, if you're rehabbing a well, ground storage tanks, elevated storage tanks, pressure tanks, clarifiers, these kind of things, major units, we want to see rehab of your storage tanks, elevated, ground storage, pressure tanks. You're recoating the interior, the exterior. You're patching the tank walls. You're doing a rehab package on that unit. It needs to be brought back to life. Well, yeah, we'd like to look at that. But on the other hand, if you're just replacing a ladder, you're replacing a flap valve, something like that, those things you can do without submitting to plan review. There are other significant changes that require notification. When you're doing something that changes you're adding another chemical, those need to be submitted. And also, there's a discussion here of what to do with RO plants. So, significant at the water plant, you're changing the coagulant or the polymers. Really, it's kind of changes, especially that affect corrosivity, the addition of new chemicals, acids, bases, phosphates. Those things need to be submitted for plan review. And of course, those would be, here's the pump, here's the storage, here's a calculation of how much dosing we're trying to do, and a summary of what we're trying to get at with this equipment. Filter rehabs, let's say you're going in and replacing the under drain system and you're changing that, and you decided to go upgrade to something else. That would need to be submitted for plan review. Let's say you're adding air scour to an existing filter. That we need to look at that. Now we finally got to what you really wanted to hear about. What is not significant? Okay, so not significant in distribution. If it's less than 10% of the connections, then you don't need to submit it to us for review. And also keep in mind that you have the capacity in your source, in your storage, in your pressures to accommodate these users, then you don't need to submit it. But if you are bumping up against those levels, then you need to submit it and tell us what you're going to do to address those other issues. Pipe rehab does not need to be submitted for plan review. Rehab of appurtenances like fire hydrants, valves, meter replacement, those kind of things do not need to be submitted for plan review. So what might be not significant, we're in not significant, so you don't need to submit. At the water plant, if you're trading out, you're rehabbing the pump, you're putting in a pump of the same size, that doesn't need to be submitted. Valve replacements, yard piping modifications, you're replacing a motor, or you're reworking the electrical, those things don't need to be submitted to us for plan review. So on well rehab, I said we'd talk about this a little more. So if you're rehabbing your well and you're pulling the pump out, you're replacing the pump, but you're putting in the same size pump that you had, that doesn't require a plan review. And if you're doing some wellhead modifications or your drop pipe, you're putting in, you're changing those appurtenances, and you're you still need to do these things according to the rules, but you don't need to submit for plan review. So a little more on what's not significant at the surface water treatment plant. So let's say you're doing a filter rehab, and you're going to remove the anthracite and the sand and put back new anthracite and sand, and you're just doing it. You're doing it according to the specs that were required when you go back and get your specs out and you put in the same thing. Then you don't need to submit that for plan review. And that would also include the basin equipment inside there if you're putting back what you had before. So in your said basin clarifier, if you're pulling out the equipment and reinstalling the same equipment, you don't need to submit it for plan review. And that would go for the flocculation basin also. Sometimes or often municipal utility districts need a letter from the TCEQ approving their plans or addressing their plans. And so we do a thing on less than 10%. And communities will send us a cover letter that says, we're doing a project that's less than 10% addition of connections, and we're going to add so many feet of 8-inch SDR 26 C900 PVC pipe, and then this many feet of 12-inch, and they tell us what it is, and if we agree with them, then we'll send a letter back that says, yes, that's less than 10%, go ahead. And that's something they can have in their records that they have that. There's another category. These are letters that we do. The City of Houston reviews distribution pipe projects, and they have worked an arrangement with the TCEQ. There's an agreement. Other cities can do this, but they have an agreement with us that their staff reviews projects in their ETJ, and they review them for their rules, but also our rules. And so their review equals our review. So somebody in the Houston area does not necessarily have to submit plans to us for review of a distribution project if the City of Houston has reviewed it. And so what that, the city signs off on those, on the front page of those plans. And so the submittal will be a copy of that sheet with the city's signature on it and the date that the city approved it. And that'll be submitted with a description of what we're doing. And we'll send back a letter that says, yes, the City of Houston has reviewed this. You don't need to submit it for TCEQ approval. So the TWD, Texas Water Development Board, reviews plans and specs for the projects that they're financing. And as they're doing that for distribution projects, we have an agreement with them that their review is equal to our review. And that would be for tanks, elevated pressure tanks, ground storage, for service pumps, and distribution. And so in those cases, the board can review on our behalf, and that is an acceptable review. But the board is not supposed to do treatment or sources. So the board does not look at surface water treatment plants, surface water intakes, wells, groundwater wells, and then any treatment, addition of chemical, those kind of things. As Vic showed, we just want to point out that there's a lot of good stuff on our webpage. If for some reason, there's a lot of people that review plans in the TCEQ for all kinds of stuff. But if you go into our webpage and type plan review, you're going to go to the public drinking water webpage and you'll see our stuff. And that's a good place to go to get instructions on how to submit plans for review, there's forms that are in there, there's checklists that help you put together a package, and there's even construction notes that you can put on your plans we have construction notes for wells, ground storage tanks, pressure tanks, and distribution that it's kind of like putting some of our rule language in there for you. Then there's some other things that are there. That's a list of some of our checklists and other available resources. And so I think that covers it. I hope that was helpful. Anybody have any questions to add to that?
On one of your slides, you had a significant change would be change to coagulation or polymers, or
Yeah.
coagulants or polymers.
Yeah.
Would switching from one proprietary polymer blend to another proprietary polymer blend of the same chemical makeup, basically, would that be a significant change?
What do you think? I'd kind of say we could, that would probably be okay. You want to add to that?
You know, you're more talking about a manufacturing from, you know, but we're more worried about the different types of polymer. If you go from a cat iron to a different, you know, positive or whatever, that could affect. And of course, when we do see the coagulants in the polymer changes, the submittal should have all the jar testing information and all the manufacturer information and all that. But if you're going, because people switch vendors, and so if you're going from this vendor to this vendor and it's all the same stuff, that's not what we're talking about. You know, if you're going to use alum and you go to Packle, yes, we want to see it. If you're going from a cation to, a non-ion, then yeah, we want to see it. But if you're switching manufacturers, that's not what we're talking about. And we're not talking about changes in daily doses, right? Because you're going to take your water quality testing and you may dial this up or that up. We're not concerned with dosing per se, but you know, if you're going to make a significant chemical change in that type of thing, we're going to want to see a package, and we want the jar testing and all of that. Does that make sense? Okay.
And that's Mr. Craig Stoll. He's head of the plan review team, so just.
So like we also had an issue after one of the winter storms that we had to get a different type of alum from our vendor because the one we usually got wasn't available. Is that something that would require? It was from the same vendor.
So, and again, whether it's winter storms or supply issues like fires knocked out a lot of the corrosion control in that, the best thing is give us a call or send us an email. The email of ptrs@tceq.texas.gov goes to the plan review section. And of course, 90% of those come to the plan review team. But you send an email there or give any of us a call and tell us your problem and we'll work through those things. Something like that, we'd probably say no, but keep us informed. There's always special circumstances, and we're always contactable and responsive to most of that stuff as fast as we can. But on something like, I'm going to switch alum types, but it's still all alum, yeah, we're not concerned with that. But again, when in doubt, send us an email.
I had a question on the pressure plane transition. So we're not changing the number of connections, but we're changing the number of connections from one pressure plane to another. Would that require?
I don't think so. As long as you know you've got the capacity in each pressure plane to deal with what you're doing, I don't think you'd need to.
Thank you.
You also talked about replacing under drains and filters. If that's just an equal replacement, does that count as
An equal replacement?
is that a substantial change? If we're having problems with our under drains and we're
Yeah.
just getting the same, just getting it rehabbed, basically with the same product we used before or whatever.
Yeah, yeah.
Is that a significant change?
No, I don't think.
It's kind of funny because we do typical presentations every year, and these last two presentations are ones that I've been wanting to do for a long time because we get these questions like that. So the first question is what's your approval letter say your under drain is, right? You know, if you're replacing, if your approval letter says, you know, you got 12 inches of anthracite, 10 inches of sand, and you know, gravel, and doesn't really mention the under drain, you're going to pull out the cement blocks with the balls and put in a Leopold. We want to see that. If you're having troubles with a Leopold and it's on your letter that we approved a Leopold, and so now you got to rip out your media and go in and fix your under drain. No, that's maintenance. That's not a significant change. You know, so if you're operating under your approved plans and specs, and that was a big point of what David said was, you know, if you're replacing with your approved plans and specs, then now the thing is we get questions like, well, we're going to replace our pressure filter that was put in 1973 per the original plans and specs, right? No, we're going to want to see it. Because again, do you have drawings and are you really going to submit those? And the other question is did those drawings in 1973 actually meet today's rules, right? And that's why all major units we want to see, even if you're rehabbing your ground storage tank by painting it, you know, we got rules that apply of when you do maintenance on things like hatches and paints and stuff. Yeah, because we're not normally geared for engineers. So again, you know, plan review, we look at engineering materials, but we do know that the managers always have a lot of questions for us because, you know, they have to interact with their engineers, they have to interact with their operators. So we like this information to go to all you parties because it helps us, it helps you guys. Our goal is to, you know, give you good, fast plan reviews that everybody's on the same page for. And so this is how it happens. So we thank you for attending, and I thank David for doing a great relief for the last of the ninth. Thank you.
All right. Good enough.